thank you for the invitation. We're very happy to present this, particularly after hearing James speaking and Sherry speaking. And a lot of what James said about New York City or about New York City's future is actually happening right now in many cities in Africa, right? So we're talking about the present, unfortunately, for many cities. And we're going to try and discuss the impacts of climate change from the perspective of migration, right? So someone asked after James presented his dystopian vision of what New York is going to look like, where can these people move, right? And we do have these sort of movements that are happening already in many places, particularly in Africa, right? So one of the main issues that we have is that we don't know how this is happening, right? We do have future models that tries to predict what is going to happen, but if you ask scientists who is moving now, currently, we have very little ideas about what is going on, about the nature of these flows, about how climate change interacts with other reasons, right, for moving. So we're going to present to you a project that we co-created with local communities in 4 different cities in Africa. We call it Climate Mobilities in African Cities. The reason why I think this project is relevant for the conference is because it was truly let's say a transdisciplinary effort to try and bring both climate science but also local knowledge and try and put the two together and translate them more towards policy messages, right? So some of the elements of this research is that it has been participatory from its beginning. So what we first asked the people, what should we ask, rather than us coming with a specific agenda. What we focused on is on the adaptation outcome. So there is a part in right now that says that people are going to move because of climate change, and this movement is a form of adaptation to climate change, right? But a lot of the times, it is important to understand what this adaptation means, right? Do people truly adapt, or are they fleeing situations, right? And the reason why I think it's important from more of a policy perspective is that this sort of approach can be scaled across different African cities. We work with a network of community-based organizations called Slum Dwellers International. They are active in about 300 cities in the global south. And the focus is on promoting the inclusion of local communities in the co-production of knowledge, right? So the idea is, what is the sort of information that we're missing, and how can we understand this from the perspective of the communities that we are working together with. I think we can move to the next slide. This is the places that we looked into. So Freetown, Sierra Leone, Monrovia, and Liberia. Accra and Ghana and Dar es Salaam. We looked at specific settlements in these areas. Many of these settlements were coastal settlements. In the next slide, you can see a little bit some of the settlements and the issues that we're talking about. This is Glefe in Accra, Ghana, which, as you can tell, is right by the coast. This is an image from 2002 where you see that actually there's very few structures in Glefe, right? And about 20 years later, where you see that it's completely populated and extremely densely populated, this high densities, together with the sort of issues that they might face in terms of proximity to water, flooding that might occur in these areas, can be quite problematic, right? Creating this sort of compounding risks, right? Another settlement we worked in is West Point in Monrovia. You can clearly see a big chunk of this peninsula missing. We're talking about, again, a very small amount of time where this is happening. And a lot of people, what we found is that they constantly kind of replacing their structures to create new structures, whether in the settlement or somewhere else in the city. Let's move to the next slide. So this is a little bit the method that we used. So starting with a survey questionnaire that we developed together, we asked what kind of should be the sort of questions that we are asking, and how should we frame a lot of these questions. A lot of these areas that we worked in were extremely idiosyncratic in some ways. It's not the natural built environment that you find in cities. There's no networked infrastructure as you usually find in cities. A lot of the basic services are provided through informal networks. Then we selected locations based also on evidence from the people. We asked people, where do you think people are, or where do migrants are coming into the city? What are some of the settlements that are under specific threats, right? And then we collected the data. We collected about 4,000 responses in total from residents in the settlements. And then we try to create what we call knowledge feedback mechanisms, right? So instead of using the kind of typical extractive research system where we get the data from communities, then we bring it back to New York or wherever we are, we write academic papers that only academics read and they don't necessarily affect policy. We try to think how the knowledge that we produce can actually affect policy on the ground in the cities, right? So how we can create knowledge feedback mechanisms that go back into the community, translate the sort of research messages into policy actions, and then have representatives from the communities, community leaders, other organizations working in the cities, pushing local governments for the sort of necessary changes, right? These changes are important because a lot of the times in these places, people talk about relocation, moving settlements without necessarily the consent of communities. There's widespread evictions that happen with the rationale of climate threats, right? So we have to bulldoze your settlement because it's very close to the water, right? So these are important tools for the different communities to have in order to be able to make sure that beyond climate change, their life is not affected also by hostile governments. I'm going to let Manavi now speak a little bit about the data that we collected and more specifics.
Yeah, so I think one of the key advantages that we are finding with a participatory research model is you kind of ensure that this framework sort of comes through at multiple stages, right? And at different stages, you're probably going to have different degrees of participation. But if you have the model in place, you can really develop research tools, develop data collection mechanisms and sort of feedback loops that continuously make it more generative. What has happened in the process is that we're able to analyze data on multiple scales. So the next few slides, I'm going to breeze through them really fast as just examples of data points that we have on these three scales. On a macro level, we started off understanding what is the larger policy context and changes that are going to drive migration in important coastal cities across Africa, right? You have the 2018 Free Movement Protocol, you have the 2063 Agenda for ensuring there's free movement of people, goods, and services across countries in the continent, but then that gives us a local context where the slum population is growing faster than the urban growth rate itself in a lot of the cities. You have a lot of neighborhoods which are in need of investments in situ adaptation strategies. And they need to be fast yet resilient adaptation strategies that need to happen on the slum level. And then another example, if you look at it from a spatial perspective and having spatial data coming in on a macro level, you start to see that in the case of Salaam, for example, in Tanzania, you have a lot of the migration that's happening is regional. So it gives us a hint towards the kind of migration pattern that is getting formed in this city, possibly some amount of micro-mobility. So like if people do end up moving, they keep moving for multiple reasons. So it's almost like a slight indication towards like this new cycle of uncertainty that people get into. On an analytical level, these are, again, data points which are more, built on our reasoning of the data and sort of understanding why are some things happening, what is the reason behind it. So a lot of a mix of deductive and abductive reasoning taking place in this. So in this case, we were trying to ask, why are people moving to Dar es Salaam? What are the different reasons for it? And trying to really go into different social reasons, different economic reasons. From this, we do realize that when people move, environmental factors are not, top of mind, but they become big factors in how people experience the new place. So once they enter, there are different climate stressors, and this is these are some of this like the core stress that have come up in our through the survey. You'll see that there's a lot of interlinkage between a lot of these, right? So there's because there's coastal, you're going to see a lot to do with water-related climate stressors. But water shortage is also an important one to point out, and that is very much related to flooding. If you have more flooding happening, you have already sort of, ad hoc water resources within the slum settlements sort of getting affected, and that creating a ripple effect. Because it was a comparative context, we could also compare different geographies and different cities that we were looking into, right? So in Accra, for example, you will notice that the survey shows that there's a fewer proportion of people who said that they have experienced damage from climate-related events, as opposed to Freetown, which has a higher proportion of people. So then we had data points around why this could be a reason. And we started mapping data points around the build of different of households, like what is the infrastructural build of households in the two settlements. Does it differ in any way? Could that be a possible reason as to why people are having lesser damage in Accra versus Freetown? And we had several different variables we were comparing against. This is one example of just the difference in the kind of toilets that are available. In Accra, you see that they have moved on to pour flush and pit latrine toilets. But in Freetown, you have most households dependent on hanging toilets, and a significant number depending on flying toilets. So I think these are examples of sort of bringing that reasoning in. And finally, on the experiential level, we were able to collect narratives because we're working with local partners. They were able to talk in local languages and have conversations. We were also able to get narratives around, what does it mean for there to be, if we ask people to rank their degree of damage, what does it mean for it to be at a level 2 versus a level 5? And we were able to sort of bring in some of that to really reason and say that there are various things that contribute to economic uncertainty that end up contributing to a constant cycle of uncertainty that the population ends up facing. And finally, this one data point around, again, really getting into the experiential information, because we got pictures from our partners as they visited different households, and all of these are geotagged. So when you get pictures, you sort of understand how does the build change within a settlement, and that can further hyper localize strategies within slum settlements, and we can sort of we are able to sort of advance that those strategies in a different way. All of this sort of comes together to kind of work on a policy level, but also on really understanding on a neighborhood level, what are the advocacy efforts needed? Where are the gaps in terms of people's knowledge about what are the precautions they need to take? So various things can come up on this scale, and that is what I think Achilles was pointing out earlier, to kind of have a feedback loop going back to community organizations with this new data to kind of influence their local strategies. Achilles, do you just want to wrap us up with this slide?
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Manavi. So how are we thinking about next steps on this? As I said earlier, we're working with an organization that is a network organization of slum communities, of the urban poor. So we are in the process of trying to scale this effort in the 4 cities across a large number of cities. Some of the frameworks that were mentioned earlier in the conference, like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Compact on Migration, the 2030 Agenda for Urban Development, and other UN frameworks, they do mention clearly local data, but there's nothing really happening in terms of trying to get local data. It's also very difficult to do this in contexts where people are thought to be illegal, or that they are squatting illegally on certain land. They don't necessarily trust their governments to carry that data. So there is a powerful lesson in terms of communities documenting themselves, their conditions, and pushing for this sort of change. In practice, we're setting up a series of workshops that we try to inform other communities within the network about the work that was done in the 4 cities. And then Slum Dwellers International, the organization we're working with, has an active campaign called Know Your City, based on a first campaign that they did. They try to actually, their slogan is making the invisible visible, and try to put some focus on these poor communities that are the main urban communities affected by climate events. And this is not something that is happening in the future, but actually something that is currently occurring a little bit. The dystopia that James was providing earlier on New York is actually something that is happening in cities that are going to be the biggest cities in terms of population by the end of the century.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. One of the things I thought was so interesting when you were talking about, you were showing data, 2 sets of data, and you brought it up later on that people were unwilling to speak. Were saying, what was the term? Don't know, wouldn't answer was on one of the charts. About that, I thought was really interesting. How prevalent was that, did you find, and how are you addressing that as an ongoing issue?
So let me try and take this one. So it's quite prevalent, and especially when it comes to issues that are very personal. So what type of toilet are you using? Many people, feel that this is personal information. They don't want to reveal this. There is a lot of shame involved into the sort of situation that they're in. Not so much because they don't know about hygiene, but because they don't have the means to practice good hygiene, right? So one way to deal with this, and I think this is very important in these situations, is to try not involve the government or involve outsiders in the sort of questions that are happening. So all this survey occurred without neither me or Manavi being present there. The people who gathered the information were members from the community. So it was basically someone, your neighbor, asking you a lot of these questions. This has 2 positives. One, it removes a little bit of the bias and suspicion of the locals, right? I always, tell my students, imagine a government official from a government that has evicted your family a month ago, coming in and asking you very personal questions about your living conditions. Of course, you're not going to answer truthfully, and of course, you don't want these people to come in, even if it is for a good cause, which is a census, for instance, right? So I think this local information solves a lot of the problems in terms of research, but I think there's a more powerful lesson in terms of empowering communities and making them kind of get a clearer picture of what is going on. Typically when you talk to policymakers in the cities, they're going to tell you, oh, these are slums, these are poor people. They provide this sort of amorphous picture of what is happening. Once you start getting the data, you start having a clearer picture. Yes, these are slums, but in one of them, the sanitation condition is much better than in another one, right? Or in one situation, there's more resilience to climate shocks, right? This is important information for seeing things not as a social problem, but as a problematic situation that can be actually addressed, right? Not as something that we kind of put our hands up and say, there's nothing to do about it. These people are very poor. And I think this is kind of the main idea here, is how do we focus on the areas where the climate crisis is actually occurring right now, and how do we make sure that we put the accent in these places? We are all threatened by what is called climate change, but some of us are way more threatened than others.